There is a window of time in the Afghan highlands that lasts no longer than 3 weeks. After that window closes, everything changes. The passes fill with snow. The roads, what little exists of them, disappear beneath meters of ice. Supply lines that were already thin become impossible. And the families living inside stone houses, perched on cliffs and mountain shelves, are suddenly, completely, on their own. No outside help coming. No emergency services within reach. No second chance if something critical was left undone. The preparation for winter in these highland communities is not a seasonal chore. It is the most consequential engineering project of the entire year, and it begins with the roof. That detail surprises most people. When we picture winter survival, we think of food stockpiles or warm clothing. But in an Afghan stone house above 2,000 meters, the roof is the difference between life and a catastrophe so slow it is almost invisible. It does not collapse suddenly. It fails quietly, over days, under the weight of wet snow and the pressure of accumulated ice, and by the time the family inside understands what is happening, the temperatures outside are already too dangerous to fix anything. So, before the first snow falls, before the cold settles in, the men and women of these mountain villages climb to the top of their houses and do something that looks, from the outside, almost absurdly simple. What they are actually doing is anything but. If this kind of documentary takes you somewhere you have never been before, into the engineering of lives the modern world forgot to notice, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. There is much more to discover here. The roofs of traditional Afghan highland houses are flat. Not flat the way a modern concrete terrace is flat, but flat in the old, deliberate way of mountain architecture. Slightly inclined, layered, compacted over generations of trial and failure. To someone unfamiliar with the logic of high-altitude construction, this seems like a design mistake. Every assumption about mountain buildings says you need a pitched roof to shed snow. You need an angle steep enough that accumulation slides off before it crushes the structure beneath. But the families living in these houses did not build them flat because they lacked knowledge of slopes. They built them flat because the slope would have killed them in a different way. Pitched roofs in extreme wind environments become sails. At the elevations where these communities live, valleys flanked by peaks reaching 5,000 and 6,000 meters, the wind does not pass through. It channels, accelerates through narrow gorges, and strikes with a sustained force that modern weather stations in more accessible regions rarely record. A pitched roof in that environment would tear. It would peel. It would become a liability the moment a winter storm arrived with full intensity. The flat roof, by contrast, offered a surface that wind could cross without catching, and a structural mass that resisted uplift precisely because of its weight. The roof was not an oversight. It was a calculated answer to the most violent seasonal force in the environment. But that answer created a new problem. If the roof is flat, snow accumulates, and snow, in these mountains, does not stay powder. It compacts under its own weight, absorbs moisture from temperature fluctuations, and transforms into something closer to ice than to the light flakes that fell from the sky. A single meter of that compacted material on a traditional roof can weigh more than any other structural load the house will ever face. So the pre-winter repair process was never simply about patching holes. It was about rebuilding the roof's capacity to carry what was coming. The surface of a traditional highland Afghan roof is a compressed mixture of earth, clay, straw, and sometimes animal hair. This combination, when properly maintained, creates a material that is simultaneously flexible enough to accommodate slight structural shifts and dense enough to resist water penetration. The clay swells when it absorbs moisture, sealing microcracks before they can grow. The straw binds the material together, preventing the kind of surface cracking that appears when a material dries and contracts too quickly in autumn cold. The animal hair, from sheep or goat, whatever the household raised, added tensile strength that no amount of pure clay could replicate. This was not a recipe passed down in books. It was transmitted through observation and correction. from elders to children, on the roof itself, in the weeks before winter arrived. Every autumn, the men of the household inspected every centimeter of that surface. They pressed their hands into it, feeling for softness that indicated a compromised layer underneath. They traced the lines where the roof met the walls, looking for separations where cold air could infiltrate and where meltwater could pool and refreeze. In a house with multiple rooms and additions built across generations, the roof was not a single plane. It was a patchwork of sections from different eras, each settling at a slightly different rate, each presenting its own vulnerabilities. Finding all of them before the window closed required the kind of attention that is difficult to train from scratch. It was knowledge embedded in muscle memory, learned from years of doing the same walk beside an older relative who knew where to look. When a weak point was found, the repair was direct and physical. Fresh clay mixture was prepared in the courtyard, mixed with water drawn before the cold made the source inaccessible, combined with chopped straw from the harvest that had just finished, and worked by hand until it reached a consistency that held its shape without crumbling. This mixture was carried to the roof in heavy loads and pressed into the damaged area with wooden tools and bare palms, compacted in layers, each layer allowed to partially dry before the next was added. The sequence mattered. Too many layers at once, and the base layer remained wet, freezing before it could cure properly, expanding and cracking the repair from within. One layer at a time, allowed to set, allowed to breathe. That was the discipline the process demanded. There was a tool used in this compaction that appears so basic it almost invites condescension. A heavy wooden roller, sometimes a cylindrical stone, dragged back and forth across the freshly laid clay. But what this tool accomplished was not simple compression. It was the elimination of air pockets. Air inside a clay layer is the enemy of cold weather durability. When temperatures drop, moisture trapped in those air pockets freezes, expands, and ruptures the surrounding material from the inside out. The roller drove that air out, consolidated the particles, and produced a surface density that could withstand the freeze-thaw cycles that would repeat hundreds of times over the winter months. Whoever designed this process understood the physics of material failure long before the language existed to describe it formally. While the roof work was happening, something was also being done inside the house that would determine whether the family survived the coldest months with any degree of comfort, or whether they survived at all. The hearth system of a Highland Afghan stone house is, in many ways, the most misunderstood element of the entire structure. It looks at first like a simple fire in the center of a room, but the way that fire was prepared, fueled, managed, and integrated into the architecture around it was the product of an engineering logic that most modern observers completely miss. The primary heat source in many of these houses was the tandoor, a clay-lined pit or chamber embedded in the floor or in the central room, capable of burning slow-burning fuel for hours without requiring constant attention. Unlike an open fire that radiates heat in all directions and loses most of it to the ceiling, the tandoor concentrated combustion downward and outward through the surrounding clay mass, which absorbed heat and released it slowly and steadily long after the active fire had reduced to coals. This thermal mass principle, the same principle at the heart of passive solar architecture in modern sustainable design, was operating in these houses centuries before sustainability became a concept in Western engineering discourse. The fuel for this system was prepared weeks in advance, and the preparation was as technical as the roof repair. Animal dung, from cattle, sheep, and donkeys, was collected, mixed with straw and sometimes sawdust, formed into flat cakes, and dried in the late autumn sun before storage. This sounds utilitarian, and it is. But the reason it worked better than simple wood was specific and observable. Dried dung burns at a lower, steadier temperature than dry wood. It does not spike in heat and then collapse quickly. It sustains a long, moderate burn that keeps the clay mass of the tandoor saturated with heat through the night. A family that had correctly prepared and stored enough of this fuel could maintain a livable interior temperature even when the outside air dropped to 30 degrees below zero. A family that had not prepared enough faced a slow crisis that unfolded over weeks. The storage of that fuel was itself a design challenge. It had to be protected from moisture. Wet fuel would not ignite well and would produce heavy smoke inside an enclosed space, which in winter, with limited ventilation, was a serious danger. So the fuel cakes were stacked in sheltered areas adjacent to the house, under overhanging sections of roof or in enclosed storage chambers that were part of the house structure itself. The position of these chambers was not accidental. They were placed on the side of the building protected from prevailing winds, often the eastern or southern face depending on valley orientation, so that driving snow would not pack against the entrance and make access difficult during the worst weather. Ventilation inside these stone houses is another system that modern visitors frequently misread. The houses appear sealed. Small windows, low doorways, thick walls, everything suggests an effort to close the interior off from the world outside. But a house that is completely sealed in winter is a house where combustion exhaust accumulates, where moisture from cooking and breathing condenses on walls and freezes, and where the air quality degrades to a point that creates chronic illness. These families were not building sealed boxes. They were building systems that balanced heat retention against air exchange with extraordinary precision. The small apertures high in the walls, sometimes no larger than a handspan, were not structural accidents or symbolic openings. They were positioned to take advantage of the stack effect. Warm air rising inside the room would exit through these high openings while cold outside air entered through lower gaps near the floor. The movement was slow, controlled, and continuous. It was enough to prevent dangerous accumulation of combustion gases while losing only a fraction of the hard-earned warmth that the tandoor and its fuel had produced. Getting that balance wrong was not a theoretical mistake. In an enclosed mountain house in deep winter, it was the kind of mistake that a family might not recover from. And yet the story of these houses is not only a story of managing danger, it is also a story of how people built warmth into the space in ways that were social, not just physical. The central room of a Highland Afghan home in winter became something that has no direct equivalent in modern domestic architecture. A thermal commons. The animals, goats, sheep, sometimes a cow, were brought inside through a separate but connected chamber, usually at the lowest level of the house. Their body heat, combined with the heat produced by their digestion, rose through the floor and into the living space above. This was not desperation. It was deliberate design. The arrangement meant that the family's livestock also survived the winter in conditions that maintained their productive capacity, emerging in spring capable of producing milk and young. The warmth exchange was mutual and calculated. If you are realizing at this point that what looked like poverty and limitation was actually a layered and deliberate system, please consider liking this video or subscribing. This kind of documentary takes real research to build, and your support makes it possible to keep going. The walls themselves were part of the thermal system in ways that go beyond simple insulation. Stone, as a material, has a high thermal mass. It absorbs heat during the hours when the interior is warm and releases it during the hours when the fire is low or unlit. In a house with walls that are sometimes a meter thick, this buffering effect means that the interior temperature does not drop instantly when the fire goes cold. It drops slowly, over many hours, giving the family time to respond, to reignite, to manage. But only if the walls were maintained correctly. Cracks in the stone or mortar, the kind that appeared every autumn as the structure shifted with temperature changes, had to be filled before the first hard freeze. Because once water entered a crack and froze, it expanded, and what had been a hairline fracture became a structural failure waiting to deepen with every subsequent freeze-thaw cycle. The mortar used to fill these cracks was made from the same clay mixture as the roof, sometimes with the addition of ash from previous fires, which altered the chemical composition of the clay and made it more resistant to repeated wetting and drying. The families who knew to add ash, and who knew approximately how much, had learned this through observation of which repairs lasted and which crumbled by spring. The knowledge was empirical, accumulated across generations, and passed not through formal instruction, but through proximity. A child watching a grandmother mix the repair paste in the courtyard, asking nothing but absorbing everything. The doorways of these houses presented a specific problem that every family addressed in their own way. A doorway is the most thermally vulnerable part of any structure. It is an opening that, in winter, becomes a conduit for cold air every time it is opened, and a source of heat loss even when it is closed, if the seal is poor. The solution in Highland Afghan houses was layered. A primary door of heavy wood, sometimes lined with felt on the interior face, combined with a secondary barrier, a thick curtain of woven material, sometimes a repurposed carpet, hung just inside the doorway. This double barrier created a small buffer zone between the exterior and the interior, trapping a pocket of air that never fully equalized with the outside temperature. It was a rudimentary airlock, and it worked with a reliability that more sophisticated modern solutions in extreme climate architecture have worked to replicate. Snow management was ongoing throughout winter, not just a pre-winter concern. The flat roof, which accumulated snow rather than shedding it, required regular clearing during heavy snowfall events. This sounds straightforward, but in practice it was a task with specific rules that determined whether clearing the roof made the structure safer or more dangerous. Snow had to be cleared from the center of the roof outward, never from the edges inward, because a roof cleared from the edges would lose the snow that was providing lateral support to the parapet walls at the perimeter. Those walls, which appeared decorative or symbolic, were structural members that the snow itself was helping to brace. Remove the snow from around them suddenly, and they became vulnerable to the lateral pressure exerted by the next snowfall from above. The timing of clearing also mattered. Clearing snow during active wind created conditions where the cleared surface was exposed to driven ice crystals that could infiltrate the clay layer at microscopic scale, accelerating the cracking process. Experienced families waited for a calm period, cleared quickly, and then applied a thin layer of ash or dry earth to the exposed surface, which protected the clay from the next wind event. This post-clearing protection step is invisible in any photograph of these houses. It leaves no physical trace, but it was the step that determined whether the same repair held through the season or had to be done again within weeks. The children of these households were not observers of this process. They were participants from a young age, carrying materials, spreading mixtures, learning the physical vocabulary of structural maintenance through their hands before they could reason about it analytically. A 12-year-old in one of these villages knew more about roof failure mechanics and clay material behavior than most civil engineering graduates in wealthy countries. Not because the 12-year-old was exceptional, but because the knowledge was embedded in daily life and transmitted as a survival necessity rather than academic information. The fire inside the house was also managed according to rules that went beyond simply keeping it burning. The timing of when to build a large fire and when to let it drop to coals was calibrated to the thermal mass of the building itself. A large fire built late at night was less efficient than a large fire built in the late afternoon, because the clay walls and floor needed hours to absorb the heat peak before they could release it slowly through the coldest pre-dawn hours. Families who understood this burned their most significant fuel loads in the afternoon, allowed the structure to saturate with heat, and then maintained only a modest coal bed through the night. By dawn, the walls had released enough stored heat that the interior had not dropped to dangerous temperatures, and a relatively small amount of fuel was needed to bring the temperature back up for the morning hours. Water was another critical pre-winter calculation. Sources that were accessible in autumn, streams, shallow wells, runoff channels, would freeze or become inaccessible under snow. The preparation involved identifying which water source would remain partially accessible through winter, usually a spring at depth whose ground temperature prevented complete freezing, and planning the household's water use around that source's reduced output. Storage vessels, clay pots, wooden containers, were filled and positioned inside the house where the interior temperature would keep them from freezing. Cooking water and drinking water were managed separately from water for animal care, which was drawn from outside sources and sometimes obtained from melted snow heated near the fire. The coordination of all these preparations, roof repair, fuel accumulation, wall maintenance, door insulation, water storage, animal integration, ventilation calibration, happened within a span of 3 weeks across an entire village simultaneously. Because these tasks were not individual, they were communal. Neighbors helped neighbors finish roof repairs before the cold arrived. Shared knowledge of which clay sources produced the most durable mix was freely exchanged. The preparation for winter was a collective project, and the logic behind that collective approach was not merely social, it was structural. A family that fell behind in their preparations became a vulnerability for the entire community, because in a winter emergency, help could only come from the houses nearby. The first snowfall of the season, in these villages, was not greeted with anxiety by families who had completed their preparations. It was received with something closer to confirmation. The roof held. The mortar stayed sealed. The fuel stored dry through the transition weather. The animals settled into the lower chamber. The tandoor held its heat through the night. All of it worked because all of it had been thought through, rehearsed across generations, adjusted based on what had failed before, and transmitted not as theory, but as practice. The snow arrived, and the house answered it. What is remarkable, when you look at this system as a whole, is not that these families survived conditions that would defeat most modern people without infrastructure support. What is remarkable is that they survived with comfort, with warmth, with stored food, with community, with the kind of daily life that continued functioning even at the extremes. The houses were not bunkers, they were homes. The survival was not desperate, it was engineered. The stone houses of the Afghan highlands are frequently described in humanitarian and journalistic contexts as symbols of poverty, of isolation, of the absence of development. But that description misses something essential. These houses were developed. They represented the outcome of centuries of iterative design, material testing, failure analysis, and knowledge refinement conducted under conditions that demanded accuracy because inaccuracy was lethal. The roof was not flat because no one thought to make it pitched. The walls were not thick because stone was all that was available. The fire was not in the center because tradition demanded it. Every feature of these structures was an answer to a specific question that the environment had posed, and the answer had been tested until it was reliable. The modern world builds climate-controlled buildings, pumps heat into them from external energy sources, and calls this comfort. The Highland Afghan house built its comfort into the material, into the orientation, into the relationship between fire and mass and airflow, and the bodies of the animals sharing the space. It did not require external energy, because it had internalized the physics of its environment so thoroughly that the environment itself became part of the heating system. That is not primitivism. That is a form of engineering sophistication that most of the modern world forgot to develop because it had the luxury of forgetting. The window of 3 weeks before winter is also a window into a different understanding of what it means to be prepared. In contemporary life, preparation for most challenges is something done at the last moment, mediated by purchasing power or institutional support. In these villages, preparation was the achievement. The house that entered winter correctly prepared was already the success story. The rest of winter was simply living inside that achievement, maintaining it, and trusting the accumulated intelligence of every generation that had made the same choices before. There is something in that worth sitting with. Not romanticism about hardship. The cold was real, the dangers were real, and the losses when preparation failed were devastating. But there is something worth recognizing in a community that understood its environment so precisely that it could design against it with nothing more than stone, clay, straw, fire, and accumulated knowledge. That is a form of intelligence, and it deserves to be seen. If this documentary gave you a window into a world that most people walk past without looking, leave a comment below and tell us what you want to explore next. Whether it is another traditional house built for an extreme climate, another survival system hidden inside an ordinary-looking structure, another community whose intelligence the modern world has been too distracted to notice. We want to hear from you. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the moment. There is a great deal more to uncover, and all of it is waiting for you here.